The amendment nobody enforces. How to save the 10th Amendment. How to sue the federal government back into its constitutional lane, why your tax bill is running in reverse, and why the people in Washington are praying you never figure any of this out. Beeski's classroom. I want you to sit with something for a second. Your civics teacher lied to you. Not on purpose. I am a teacher, so I'm allowed to say this. But they absolutely, positively handed you wrong information with full confidence, and you believed it, and so did they, because their teacher handed it to them the same way. It is the educational equivalent of the myth that blood is blue inside your body until oxygen hits it, or that you only use 10% of your brain, or that Albert Einstein failed math as a child. None of those are true. None of them. And yet I have repeated some of these at some point before I knew better, because that is how generational ignorance works. You do not need malice. You just need unchecked repetition. So here's the thing your teacher got wrong that actually matters. The federal government is not supposed to be running your retirement, your healthcare, your food stamps, your housing vouchers, your energy bill, your childcare subsidy. It was never authorized to do any of that, not even close. And the argument that it can, the legal argument, the constitutional argument, rests on a series of politically pressured court decisions made by justices who were watching President Franklin Delano Roosevelt threaten to pack the Supreme Court with 6 extra seats if they did. Not stop blocking his programs. That is not jurisprudence. That is institutional self-preservation dressed in a robe. And 90 years later, we are all still living inside the constitutional fiction it produced. Class is in session. Grab something to drink. 28 words that Washington pretends do not exist. The 10th Amendment. You know it, or you think you do. Let me give it to you word for word, because the words matter. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. 28 words, ratified in 1791, part of the original Bill of Rights. Written by people who had just spent years fighting a war against a government that thought it could do whatever it wanted and who were determined not to build another one. James Madison, the man is literally called the father of the Constitution. I am not being dramatic, wrote in Federalist No. 45, that the powers given to the federal government are few and defined, while the powers left to the states are numerous and indefinite. That was not a throwaway line. That was the design. The whole point, the architecture, the entire republic was built on. And then there's Alexander Hamilton, who everyone loves to quote right now, and who, interesting fact, actually wanted a stronger central government than Madison did. Hamilton was the pro-federal power guy in the room. And even H.E. wrote in Federalist No. 17 that the administration of private justice between citizens of the same state, the supervision of agriculture and of other concerns of a similar nature, all those things which are proper to be provided for by local legislation can never be desirable cares of a general jurisdiction. Hamilton said it. The guy who wanted more federal power said welfare, agriculture, local care, not Washington's job. So we have the text of the amendment. We have Madison. We have Hamilton. We have Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which lists what Congress is actually allowed to do. And I want you to go read it right now. Because the words food, healthcare, retirement, housing, and childcare do not appear in it. Not once, not implied, not hinted at. The list of enumerated powers is specific and deliberate, and it does not include running a national nutrition program or mandating that every American worker pay into a federal retirement scheme. If those powers are not on the list, and the 10th Amendment says everything not on the list belongs to the states, then what exactly is SNAP? What is Medicaid? What is Social Security? I will tell you what it is. It is 90 years of federal government doing whatever it wanted and daring anyone to stop it. The New Deal's dirty secret and the court that blinked. Here's the part of American history that the textbooks gloss over in about 2 sentences. In the 1930 seconds, the Supreme Court was striking down FDR's New Deal programs because, and this is going to shock you, they were unconstitutional. The court kept ruling that Congress was legislating beyond its enumerated powers, that the federal government was intruding into areas the Constitution reserved to the states. In United States versus Levin, Butler in 1936, the court specifically said, the spending clause is not a substantive grant of legislative power that lets Congress regulate things the states were supposed to handle. FDR's response? He threatened to add 6 new justices to the Supreme Court. Pack it, dilute the constitutional objections with new votes. He called it the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill of 1937, because at least he had the decency to give it a bureaucratic-sounding name instead of calling it what it was, which was a threat. And here is what happened next. The court, and the phrase historians use for this, is genuinely one of the best in all of American legal history, performed what they call the switch in time that saved 9. One justice changed his vote. The constitutional objections evaporated. New Deal programs started surviving. And Helvering v. Davis in 1937 upheld Social Security by essentially saying the 10th Amendment is a truism that does not actually limit what Congress can do with spending. A truism. That is what a politically threatened Supreme Court called the 10th Amendment in 1937. A nothing statement. A formality. Madison is somewhere in the afterlife absolutely losing his mind. The precedents that came out of that era, Helvering, Steward Machine, carry that original sin inside them. They were not neutral constitutional analysis. They were survival decisions. And we have been stacking the entire modern welfare state on top of them ever since, like building a skyscraper on a foundation that everyone quietly knows is cracked. Okay, so can we actually sue? Yes. Here's how. This is the part where people usually get discouraged, because the standard answer is good luck with that. And look, I understand the cynicism. I have watched Congress fail combat wounded veterans for years over the Major Richard Starr Act, now SAMDT, 4056 inches, the appropriations bill. Because certain senators, I'm looking at you, Roger Wicker and Ron Johnson, cannot find the moral clarity to stop the government from stealing retirement pay from men and women whose bodies were broken in service to this country. So yes, I understand that expecting institutions to police themselves is sometimes a comedy exercise, but the legal pathways are real. And if you know where the doors are, you know which ones to knock on. Door number one is what constitutional scholars call the anti-commandeering doctrine. In New York, United States in 1992, the Supreme Court struck down a federal law that required state governments to manage radioactive waste. Justice O'Connor wrote plainly, states are not mere political subdivisions of the United States. State governments are neither regional offices nor administrative agencies of the federal government. The court reaffirmed this in Prince versus United States in 1997, killing a provision of the Brady Act that required state law enforcement officers to conduct federal background checks. And again in Murphy v. NCAA in 2018. The argument: when federal welfare programs turn state agencies into administrative arms of Washington, imposing mandates, compliance requirements, and conditions that effectively force states to administer federal regulatory schemes, that is, commandeering. That is exactly what New York v. United States said Congress cannot do. Medicaid alone consumes 30 to 40% of most state budgets and subjects state agencies to an almost unimaginable tangle of federal rules. At some point, voluntary participation becomes a legal phenomenon thin enough to read through. The federal government may neither issue directives requiring the states to address particular problems, nor command the state's officers to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program. Prince v. United States 1997. Door number two is the spending clause coercion argument. And here is the part that should make every big government advocate deeply uncomfortable, because the Supreme Court already agreed with this once. In NFIB v. Sebelius in 2012, yes, the Obamacare case, 7 of 9 justices agreed that the threat to strip all existing Medicaid funding from states that refused to expand Medicaid was unconstitutionally coercive. They called it a gun to the head. 7 justices. That is not a fringe position. That is a substantial majority of the court saying there is a constitutional line. The federal government can cross it, and coercive spending conditions that leave states no realistic choice are a constitutional violation. That analysis does not stop at Medicaid expansion. The question waiting to be fully litigated is what happens when you look at the cumulative weight of federal spending conditions across SNAP, Medicaid, housing, energy, childcare, and every other program simultaneously. At what point does the total package cross from conditional incentive to you have no actual choice? Nobody has forced that question to a final answer yet, but the court laid the groundwork. Door number 3 is the enumerated powers challenge, which pairs naturally with the 10th Amendment argument. In United States versus A. Lopez in 1995, the Supreme Court struck down the Gun-Free School Zones Act. The first time in over 50 years, the court had limited federal Commerce Clause power. Chief Justice Rehnquist warned that accepting unlimited federal power would make it hard-pressed to posit any activity by an individual that Congress is without power to regulate. United States v. Morrison followed in 2000 with the same reasoning. The Constitution, the court said, requires a distinction between what is truly national and what is truly local. Food, housing, childcare, energy, retirement. These are, by any coherent reading, what is truly local. If Congress had no enumerated power to do this in the first place, the 10th Amendment is the capstone that confirms the residual authority belongs to the states. Who actually gets to knock on those doors? The standing problem. All right, I am not going to lie to you about the hard part, because I think you deserve an honest answer. You, as an individual taxpayer who does not like where your tax dollars go, probably cannot get this case into federal court. The Supreme Court settled that in Frothingham v. Mellon in 1923. Your interest in the federal treasury is too shared with every other taxpayer, too diffuse, too indirect. Courts dismiss these for lack of Article 3 standing. You need a concrete, particularized injury, not just a well-founded objection to how the government is spending money. A state, though, a state has sovereign standing. A state can show concrete, measurable injuries: compliance costs, distorted fiscal priorities, commandeering of state agencies, forced participation in federal regulatory schemes that override what state voters actually chose. The Ohio Attorney General, Dave Yost, litigated exactly this kind of federalism argument in 2021, arguing that conditions attached to COVID relief money coercively constrained Ohio's ability to manage its own tax policy. That case went the distance. The argument was viable. What the 10th Amendment needs is a state attorney general with the political spine to build a solid factual record, file the complaint in federal district court, and litigate it through the Sixth Circuit and up to a Supreme Court that has spent 30 years, Murphy, Prince, Lopez, Morrison, NFIB, West Virginia v. EPA in 2022, signaling that it is willing to enforce federalism limits when the argument is precisely and properly constructed. The tools exist. The case law is there. The court's trajectory supports it. What is missing is the political will at the state level to pick up the fight, and the willingness to accept that the federal government is going to threaten to cut off every program it has its fingerprints on the moment the lawsuit gets filed, which is, incidentally, precisely what coercion looks like. Your tax bill is backwards, and here is why that is not an accident. Let me paint you a picture of what the tax structure is supposed to look like in a constitutional republic built on federalism. States run healthcare. States run food assistance. States run housing programs. States manage welfare. States handle retirement programs. The federal government, limited to defense, foreign policy, interstate commerce, immigration enforcement, federal courts, and the handful of other things, Article 1. Section 8 actually runs a comparatively small operation. In that world, your state taxes are higher because your state is doing more and your federal taxes are lower. Because the federal government is doing less, specifically because it is doing what it was authorized to do and not a dollar more. Instead, what we have built is the exact reverse. You pay heavy federal taxes, that money travels to Washington, Washington skims off an administrative layer. You are paying for federal employees to supervise state employees, to administer programs that never needed a federal bureaucracy in the first place, and then hands diminished resources back to states with a list of conditions that would make a loan shark blush. And then state politicians shrug and say, we have no choice, this is how it works, which is true, but only because the constitutional framework that would have prevented it was gutted in 1937 by a court that was afraid of Franklin Roosevelt. Quinn's Law number 1 says, liberalism always generates the exact opposite of its stated intent. The stated intent of federalizing welfare was efficiency and compassion. The actual result is a system that costs more, serves people worse, eliminates state innovation, destroys accountability, and most importantly, creates a permanent political dependency class that keeps voting for whoever controls the federal spending spigot. That is not help. That is leverage dressed up as compassion. And Quinn's Law number 25. Liberals are great at giving away other people's money, specifically yours, through a pipeline that has a Washington-sized hole in the middle of it. About SALT, the state and local tax deduction, I want to say something that might surprise you. The argument about capping or uncapping SALT is actually a downstream symptom of the upstream disease. In a properly ordered federal system, where state governments are doing the heavy governance lifting and federal taxes are accordingly modest, the SALT conversation barely matters. The distortion of SALT policy is a logical consequence of a federal government that expanded beyond its constitutional authorization and then had to figure out how to fund itself. Fix the root, and the symptom resolves. Voting with your feet only works if you have somewhere to go. Here's something I think about a lot, as both a teacher and someone who has lived through enough government dysfunction to write a very thick book about it. Right now, people are voting with their feet. California is hemorrhaging residents. Illinois, New York, people are not leaving because the weather got worse. They are leaving because the governments of those states are producing outcomes that make normal life financially unsustainable for the people who actually pay the bills. And they're moving to Texas, Florida, Tennessee, places where different policy choices are producing different results. That is federalism working imperfectly in the limited space it still has to operate. Justice Brandeis called states laboratories of democracy in 1932, places where, as he wrote in New State Ice Co. versus Ass, Liebman, a single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. But you cannot run a laboratory when Washington has commandeered your equipment. The Medicaid bureaucracy in Ohio and the Medicaid bureaucracy in California look nearly identical because they are administering the same federal program under the same federal rules. SNAP eligibility in Texas is nearly identical to SNAP eligibility in Vermont because Washington wrote both sets of rules. The fiction of state choice persists, while the substance of it has been quietly drained over 90 years of federal expansion into constitutionally prohibited territory. Real federalism means Ohio can try one approach, Texas can try another, and actual human beings in actual communities can look at the results and choose. That is accountability. That is competition between governments for the loyalty of their citizens. That is what the founders built, and it cannot exist when Washington controls every major lever simultaneously. The 1,963 congressional record would like a word. On January 10, 1963, Congressman A.S. Herlong, Jr. of Florida, read into the permanent record of the United States Congress a list of 45 communist goals for America. I want you to read 3 of them in the context of everything I have just walked you through, because the pattern is not even subtly hidden. Goal 29, discredit the American Constitution by calling it inadequate, old-fashioned, out of step with modern needs, and out of date. Interesting. Because every argument for the unconstitutional expansion of federal welfare programs rests on exactly that premise. The founders could not have anticipated modern poverty. The Constitution was written for an agrarian economy. We live in complex times now. The document constrains us too much. You have heard every single one of those sentences in your lifetime, probably from someone with a law degree and a congressional seat. Goal 30, discredit the American founding fathers. Present them as selfish aristocrats who had no concern for the common man. And goal 32, support any socialist movement to give centralized control over any part of the culture. Education, social agencies, welfare programs, youth groups, schools, SNAP, Medicaid, federal child care, Section 8, the Department of Education. The centralization of all of these programs in Washington is not an accident of history. It was a documented objective, entered into the congressional record in 1963. The 10th Amendment is the primary structural obstacle to completing that project, which explains a very great deal about why enforcing it is treated as a radical fringe position rather than a straightforward reading of the Bill of Rights. And while we are talking about federal spending priorities, I want to close with something personal, because this is where it stops being abstract constitutional theory and starts being about actual human beings. Congress cannot pass the Major Richard Starr Act. It has been blocked, throttled, and sat on for years. The bill, now SAMDTF, 4056 inches, the appropriations bill, would stop the federal government from deducting military retirement pay from VA disability compensation for combat wounded service. Members who were medically retired before 20 years. Men and women whose bodies were broken in service to this country. The government broke them, and then on their way out the door said, also, we are going to take some of your retirement back. The 10-year cost of the Major Richard Starr Act, $9.75 billion. Less than 1% of what we spend annually on programs the federal government was never constitutionally authorized to run. We can find trillions for constitutionally dubious welfare programs. We cannot find $975 million per year to stop stealing the retirement of soldiers whose bones and brains paid the price for American foreign policy. Senator Roger Wicker blocked it. Senator Ron Johnson blocked it twice in one day in March 2026, and then publicly misrepresented the CBO certified cost as $70 billion, when the actual number is $9.75 billion. That is not a rounding error. That is a deliberate lie. The same federal government that insists it must run your food program, your healthcare, your housing, your retirement. That government looks a combat wounded veteran in the eye and says, we do not have enough money to stop taking yours. If that does not make you furious, check your pulse. We have trillions for what the Constitution never sent. We cannot find $975 million a year to stop robbing the people who bled for this republic. Let that land, and then ask your senator why. The bottom line, for real this time, the 10th Amendment is not a relic. It is not antiquated. It is not, as the 1937 Supreme Court said, under political duress, a truism. It is a constitutional guarantee ratified by the same generation that wrote the document, designed to prevent exactly the kind of centralized federal government that we have spent 90 years building. The legal pathways exist: anti-commandeering, spending clause coercion, enumerated powers. A state attorney general willing to build the factual record and litigate it through the federal courts to a Supreme Court that has been moving in exactly this direction for 30 years, slowly but unmistakably. Your federal tax burden should be smaller. Your state tax burden should be higher. proportionally, because your state government should be the one actually running the programs that touch your daily life. The efficiency gains from eliminating the Washington administrative layer are real. The accountability gains from moving decisions to the level of government closest to the people are real. The constitutional gains from restoring the republic the founders actually designed are real. And the vote with your feet, the ability to look at what Ohio is doing versus what Texas is doing versus what California is doing and choose, only means something when the states actually have the authority to make meaningfully different choices. 28 words, written in 1791, still waiting for someone in power to take them seriously. But what do I know? I am only a science teacher and Army combat medic who actually read the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and 90 years of Supreme Court precedent, instead of getting my understanding of federal authority from a government that has a rather glaring conflict of interest in explaining its own constitutional limitations. If this article made you think, like this article so the algorithm shows it to people who need to read it. Share this. Every share helps get the word out. Use it. Comment below with your take. Do you think a state-led 10th Amendment lawsuit is viable? Is there a state AG with the spine to actually file it? Tell me. And if you want more of this, the history, the data, the case law, the stories that the textbook sanitized, join Beeski's classroom community or find me on YouTube. Better yet, subscribe. It is about the cost of a cup of coffee per month. That is it. Your support keeps this classroom open, and I promise you I will never run out of material as long as the left keeps trying to outdumb itself. At Ben Shapiro, at LibSoftTikTok, at Catter2, number MAGA, number veterans, number Trump.